Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and we are back with reading the Victorian novel, Charles Dickens's David Copperfield. Today, I'm pleased to say that we will be covering installment 12, chapters 35 to 37. I'll begin with the chapter titles, and I'll also cover some gender, looking both at Betsy and Mrs. Micawber. I'll look at different opinions about Dora from Betsy and Julia Mills. I'll cover some Victorian science, a little bit on class, and then a particularly interesting instance of biography revolving around the cooking book that David wants Dora to peruse, and I'll conclude by looking at the illustrations. The chapter titles of this installment are Depression, Enthusiasm, and a Little Cold Water. In Depression, that's where we learn about Uriah's really forceful control of Wakefield. Enthusiasm follows it up, and that's David's enthusiasm for Dora, and A Little Cold Water is a pun because the chapter is very short, hence it's little, and it's also the cold water because there is doubt cast on the efficacy of David's love for Dora. I'm going to now turn to gender with Betsy, looking specifically at kind of her thoughts on Emily. I don't know where these wretched girls expect to go. For my part, I wonder they don't knock out their brains against mantelpieces. Poor Emily, said I. Oh, don't talk to me about poor, returned my aunt. She should have thought of that before she caused so much misery. So what we see here is Betsy casting blame on women for being fallen. So when she says these wretched girls, what she's talking about is the fallen women that we have seen. So Martha and little Emily. A small pun here, she doesn't know where they expect to go. You'll remember in the previous installment, we learned about Urania Cottage and the fact that Dickens himself was thinking about where these girls can go. We also have this sense of where they go culturally, which is maybe getting sent to Australia. And then when she says she should have thought of that before she caused so much misery, we see Betsy casting blame on the women for being fallen, right? She's not putting blame on the men, which is something that we also saw happen with the people of Yarmouth blaming Emily more than Steerforth. Another example of gender comes with Mrs. Micawber. She's talking about the job that Micawber will take with Uriah Heep. That is quite sufficient. If such is the case, and Mr. Micawber forfeits no privilege by entering on these duties, my anxiety is set at rest. I speak, said Mrs. Micawber, as a female necessarily, but I have always been of the opinion that Mr. Micawber possesses what I have heard my papa call, when I lived at home, the judicial mind. And I hope Mr. Micawber is now entering on a field where that mind will develop itself and take a commanding station. So this is a pretty complicated passage because Mrs. Micawber, notice how we have that brief suspended quotation where we emphasize her gender in between I speak as a female, followed by that necessarily. So she's aware of her position in society as a woman. And she then defines herself on either side of this quotation, first in her role of being a wife to Mr. Micawber, and then as being a daughter to her papa when she lived at home. And so really what we see in this passage is something quite striking, which is Mrs. Micawber's awareness of her inability to act outside of a sphere of male influence. So she wants her life to be as good as possible. And I think that's what she's getting at here because she knows she can access that through her husband. And so she's trying to make sure he's going to be in a position that will benefit the family. Now we're going to turn to a view on Dora. And this is a really fascinating example that comes from Betsy. Oh, Trot, Trot, and so you fancy yourself in love, do you? Notice that word, fancy. Betsy knows that David is in love. And so she doesn't ask, you are in love, it's you fancy yourself in love, right? Are you building up a fantasy of love? Fancy, aunt? I exclaimed, as red as I could be. I adore her with my whole soul. So now notice that high verb that David picks up, adore, not love. Betsy, clever, clever Betsy says, Dora indeed, right? Picking up from adore to Dora, returned my aunt. And you mean to say the little thing is very fascinating, I suppose? And so here Aunt Betsy has called Dora a little thing, emphasizing maybe her youth, but also the smallness, the idea of maybe protectiveness that's required of the man, and calling her fascinating, almost in terms of bewitchment, this idea that goes along with fancy. My dear aunt, I replied, no one can form the least idea what she is. A really striking instance of David confessing he doesn't actually know Dora all that well. His aunt continues, and not silly, said my aunt. Silly, aunt? I seriously believe it never once entered my head for a single moment to consider whether she was or not. I resented the idea, of course, but I was in a manner struck by it as a new one altogether. Not light-headed, said my aunt. Light-headed, aunt? Here we have the difference between silly and light-headed. And what I want to suggest here is the difference is between what society has created of a woman and what the woman might be on her own. And so silly is the idea that somebody is created by society, right? The kind of woman that Dora is expected to be is a upper middle class woman. And so she's had a high education. That education includes music, foreign languages, foreign education, and being a suitable partner to somebody of an equal status that kind of is just looking for her to be somebody who will be present in society. The difference between that and lightheaded is an actual kind of, is she stupid, right? That's like, does she lack the ability to actually be more mature? And Betsy is trying to figure these things out. You should remember that Betsy is thinking about this because she's very concerned that David not replicate the marriage with, his father had with Clara. Because Clara and David Sr. were also ill-suited because Clara had been raised in a very similar way to Dora. And so Betsy is trying to look out for everybody. Julia Mills has a really fascinating insight into Dora. Julia is interesting in all of these ways because in a lot of peculiar kind of approaches, she thinks about the romance of the relationship and not the reality of it. And so David has suggested getting a cooking book for Dora. And Julia says, the suggestion is not appropriate to our Dora. Our dearest Dora is a favorite child of nature. She's a thing of light and airiness and joy. So David had earlier said, no one can say what manner of thing Dora is. And here Julia does tell us, she's a creature of nature. She's not a creature of society or the domestic household. She's a person that brings joy and loves life. And to ask more of her is to ask her to change her nature. In the manuscript, and what that means is this did not make the printing of the serial installment, but it was in Dickens's original manuscript. Julia had continued, she is a beautiful plant, not to be inconsiderately exposed to the rough airs of the common world. This kind of plant is a domestic plant, a one that you care for that's more decorative, and you need to give it the right conditions for it to flourish. And those conditions mean not giving it the rough airs of the common world. That is, Dora is not at all a Mrs. Micawber or a Betsy. She's somebody that society has pressured to live in a certain way, and to ask her to live otherwise is to go against kind of the training that nature has provided. I'm now going to turn to 3 different instances of Victorian science. All of these come within the space of 3 pages, and it's an absolutely fascinating experience in Dickens. So Betsy has moved in to David, and we learned this following passage. My aunt was quite gracious on the subject of the Thames. It really did look very well with the sun upon it, though not like the sea before the cottage. But she could not relent towards the London smoke, which she said peppered everything. London smoke is almost a technical term predating the origin of smog. Smog is a combination, a portmanteau of smoke and fog. It's first attested in London in 1905, and it specifically describes that combination of industrial and domestic smoke rising up and mixing with the fog that rises over the Thames. So notice how we have this parenthetical that gives us this contrast between the urban society next to the Thames versus the sea itself at the cottage. And we see this in the illustration of Phys. So if you notice here in the window, what we have are potted plants, not exactly thriving at that windowsill. And behind it, we see the chimneys with their smoke. And we also see St. Paul's Cathedral in a really fascinating way, almost this idea of nature and religion and the domestic sphere. And Aunt Betsy is kind of turning away. We'll look at what she's looking at later, but you see her pets above the birds and below her domesticated cat. And so if you're launching an environmentally critical interpretation of this moment, what you can say is people's nature in the city is not natural. And so it connects to some of this discussion we're having around Dora. The next piece of science comes from evolutionary theory, and this is around Uriah Heep and his control over Wickfield. And it's important to remember here that Darwin's Origin of Species doesn't appear until 1859. And so pre-Darwinian evolutionary theory was this idea of a teleological success of humankind. And in this idea, it admits it to evolution, but it's like animals to man. And it bases itself out of Genesis, where Adam becomes the person that gets to name nature. Adam is the pinnacle of society in that way. And David picks up on this when he says the following quote, and this is about Wickfield. It was not that he had lost his good looks or his old bearing of a gentleman, for that he had not. But the thing that struck me most was that with the evidences of his native superiority still upon him, he should submit to that crawling impersonation of meanness, Uriah Heep. The reversal of the two natures in their relative positions, Uriah's of power, Mr. Wickfield's of dependence, was a sight more painful to me than I can express. If I had seen an ape taking command of a man, I should hardly have thought it a more degrading spectacle. So in a fascinating way, what David is doing here is he's combining pre-Darwinian evolutionary theory with class theory. So we have Wickfield, who is a gentleman, and as such should have a native superiority with his class, but he is submitting to a crawling Uriah Heep. Notice that word crawling having to do with base animalism. He says this reverses their nature, and he says as such, it's worse than if an ape were taking command of a man, right? If an ape were the person in control of humankind. This undermines the idea of men being the endpoint of evolution. Then we also have physiognomy mentioned. What my aunt saw or did not see, I defy the science of physiognomy to have made out without her own consent. I believe there never was anybody with such an imperturbable countenance when she chose. So here we kind of undermine the science of physiognomy. Physiognomy is the science of looking at somebody's facial features and drawing conclusions as to their nature, whether they are mean or selfish or happy, joyful, generous. So David is kind of undermining that approach to science because he's like, no, you can't look at Betsy's face and know what kind of person or what she is thinking. And the last form of science is Galvanism. Many people are familiar with Galvanism. You might have encountered the frog experiment before, where you put electrodes into a frog and you can cause a dead frog and you can cause the legs to spasm. So this idea was that there was electricity and life still in an object that had died if it was a living object before. It actually dates a little bit pre-Victorian, and it's used in its most striking manifestation in the animation of the Frankenstein's monster by Dr. Frankenstein through the lightning bolt. And we have this moment about Uriah Heep. He jerked himself about after this compliment in such an intolerable manner that my aunt, who had sat looking straight at him, lost all patience. "Deuce take the man," said my aunt sternly. "What's he about? Don't be galvanic, sir." "I beg your pardon, Miss Trotwood," returned Uriah. "I'm aware you're nervous." "Go along with you, sir," said my aunt, anything but appeased. "Don't presume to say so. I am nothing of the sort. If you're an eel, sir, conduct yourself like one. If you're a man, control your limbs, sir." "Good God," said my aunt with great indignation. I am not going to be serpentined. and corkscrewed out of my senses. So here she's drawing on that language of Galvanism here when she says he shouldn't just twitch about. It picks up in a fascinating way on David's own language of Uriah being cadaverous. And you'll remember in a previous video, I also laid out a lot of the patterns wherein Uriah is kind of based on Frankenstein's monster, that David Copperfield has created Uriah. And here we have Betsy bringing in a little bit more of that language. She then says this fascinating thing about the idea of nature, right? If you're an eel, behave like an eel. If you're a man, control your limbs. So humankind has the ability to control what animal natures just react naturally to. Then we enter this language of the Bible. So she says, good God, referring like, yes, it's a swear, it's a curse, but it's also this reference to good God has created humans to behave in this way, and he's behaving against that. She follows this up, I am not going to be serpentined, a strong biblical word from Genesis and the serpent in Genesis. Namely, she's like, I won't be tricked and seduced in this way by the devil. And she's also not going to be corkscrewed. So we have the biblical and the practical, and we've seen corkscrews before, way back in chapter 17, when David had said, a tender young cork, however, would have had no more chance against a pair of corkscrews, talking as he was about Uriah and Uriah's mother. We have a short bit on class where David has said he's poor, and he's explaining this new situation to Dora. She ascertained from me in a few words what it was all about, comforted her, and gradually convinced her that I was not a laborer. From my manner of stating the case, I believe Dora concluded that I was a navigator, which is in this case, canal digger, and went balancing myself up and down a plank all day with a wheelbarrow, and so brought us together in peace. So David is saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. I might be saying I'm poor, but I'm not a laborer. I'm a poor intellectual. I'm a poor lower middle class person. I'm not a laborer. And so even here, we see that element of class at play that we saw with David's contempt of the butcher, for instance, earlier. All right, now we turn to the really amazing bit here about Dickens and Catherine's biography. So in 1851, Catherine Dickens wrote a cookbook using the pseudonym Lady Maria Clutterbuck, which is right down here, called What Shall We Have for Dinner? It's really amazing that this comes out the year after Copperfield. And it connects to what David's request is of Dora in chapter 37. My soul, not at all, said I cheerfully. If you will sometimes think of that and look about now and then at your papa's housekeeping and endeavor to acquire a little habit of accounts, for instance. Poor little Dora received this suggestion with something that was half a sob and half a scream. It would be useful to us afterwards, I went on. And if you would promise me to read a little cookery book that I would send you, it would be so excellent for both of us. So I want to talk about two different things here. One is the unreasonable request he's making of Dora. Remember when we talked about her being silly earlier? Society has not set her up for this. She does not have the training to be a domestic housewife. That was not what she was born to do, because in the Victorian period, you're born into your class and there's the expectations that come with that. And so when he asks her to acquire a habit of accounts, that's like asking somebody that's never taken advanced mathematics to write a treatise on physics, for instance, or to suddenly solve a pre-calculus equation. He goes even further and says, oh, read a cookery book. She's always had people in the house to do this. So this brings us to the fact that a year after David Copperfield, this book comes out, What Shall We Have for Dinner? And this is a complicated issue because this book, there's two different ways of looking at it. So some critics have said Lady Clutterbuck and this preface, which I have here on the screen on the left-hand side, sounds an awful lot like Dickens. So if you say it's by Dickens, and then what you do is you take away Catherine's own creativity. But if you say it's by Catherine, then is she imitating David, or is she imitated her husband, or what's happening with that pseudonym of Clutterbuck? So I'm going to read a little bit of this here, beginning with the idea of creating this thing. And we'll begin here. of more frequent occurrence than it used to be in the earlier days of their connubial experience. While the ever-recurring inquiry of what shall we have for dinner makes the matutinal meal of a time to dread, only exceeded in its terrors by the more awful hour of dinner. It is to rescue many fair friends from such domestic suffering that I have consented to give the world the bills of fare, which met with the approval of Sir Jonas Clutterbuck, believing that by a constant reference to them, an easy solution may be obtained to that most difficult question, what shall we have for dinner? We'll see some of this come up later on in later chapters around the cookery book. It's kind of fun to look at some of these meals: lobster cutlets, rabbit curry, rice dumplings, mashed brown potatoes, Italian cream, or vegetable soup, minced beef with bacon, cold pigeon pie, potatoes, or roast fillet of mutton, stuffed potatoes, currant pudding, toasted cheese, and watercresses. I hope you like potatoes. This also connects to another wonderful phenomenon from the 19th century, which is the 19th century women's manuals. So on the far left, I have the popular series by Mrs. Ellis addressed to various women of England. So this begins the daughters of England, but she also has the wives of England and the people that are pursuing a marriage of England. In the middle, I have a modern cookery book for private families, and it appears later, but the most famous version of this is Mrs. Beeton's Household Management. Notice how massive this book is, which essentially gives you every detail on how to run a household. A question that comes up in this chapter that I find particularly fascinating is whether or not David is becoming like Murdstone. So David talks to Dora in the following way. "Sweetheart," I returned, "there is nothing to alarm you in all this. I want you to think of it quite differently. I want to make it nerve you and inspire you, Dora." "Oh, but that's so shocking," cried Dora. "My love, no. Perseverance and strength of character will enable us to bear much worse things." So this, I think, reminds us of Murdstone's language of firmness. "You must be firm, Clara," he continually said. "But I haven't got any strength at all," said Dora, shaking her curls. "Have I, Jip? Oh, do kiss Jip and be agreeable." Like Dora is saying, I was not raised for this. You are demanding too much of me at this moment. David then follows us up. "It was impossible to resist kissing Jip when she held him up to me for that purpose, putting her own bright, rosy little mouth into kissing form as she directed the operation, which she insisted should be performed symmetrically on the center of his nose." So here, Dora's kind of taking control, returned things to the flirtatious. David says, "I did as she bade me," right? He gives in. He kind of likes being told what to do. He's trying to be firm himself, but it's like, it's so much easier not to be, to fall back into this pattern of their old social roles. We get a dash followed by rewarding myself afterwards for my obedience, dash, and she charmed me out of my graver character for I don't know how long. This language in the middle of rewarding himself for the obedience, he kisses her, right? So he goes from kissing the dog to kissing Dora. All right, let's look at these illustrations. So the first illustration that we have is, I think, the more interesting one, and it shows Uriah Heep bent over, cadaverous. Notice the angularity of his head, holding David's hands. The two of them maintain this intense eye contact. In the middle, we have Mr. Wickfield not maintaining eye contact with anybody, looking kind of confused, at a loss. Next to him, Agnes looks up at him concerned, but he is not maintaining eye contact with her. And Betsy looks on everybody else. Here's the same scene we saw earlier, right? We had the Thames and the smoke out the window, the birds and the cat. What's fascinating is this image in the middle above the heads of Wickfield and Agnes. It shows a castle and a sea on cliffs. This is Dover Castle and the White Cliffs of Dover. And you remember, and what we have then is two forms of framing. We have this frame of the old natural world where Betsy lived, and we have this new frame here of the reality in which she lives. And in a lot of ways, what we see on the inside of this house is bringing the exterior inside. So we have that done through the picture frame. We have that done through the birds and cages and the cat and the plant. This other picture seems to be of a woman that's difficult to see. And I would kind of argue one way of thinking about this is David struggles to see women for who they are. The other illustration shows us this, this party with Mr. Micawber. Note, things are looking up. And so we have this mirror that has no cracks in it. It's a good looking mirror. The feathers, the peacock feathers are all pretty solid. His family is all there gathered around. Even Mrs. Micawber looks pretty happy, and Traddles is leaned back and comfortable. And so we end this chapter wondering what's going to happen next. We have some worry on the side, but we also have Micawber looking up. And as we continue next week, we'll see the results of all of these different events.